So earlier we had reported to you on the Young Turks that President Obama was considering Larry Summers for the position of Fed chair. And he was also considering Janet Yellen. Janet Yellen is actually very qualified. She's vice chairwoman at the Federal Reserve right now. And she had predicted the housing bubble and the credit default swaps being an enormous problem, shadow banking being an enormous problem. She did that back in 2005 for the housing bubble and 2007 for the other two. Prescient, experienced, a ton of Democrats are behind her. And of course, I was outraged that Larry Summers would be considered because he was one of the people who deregulated the banks in the first place. And that obviously turned into the 2008 economic gigantic crash. Well, now there's news from the New York Times that it turns out Larry Summers was not the first choice of the administration. Oh, thanks God. Okay, great. So who was the first choice? Tim Geithner. Of course, Obama's former Treasury Secretary and what has been described by one author and backed up by many other reporters as Obama's, quote, man crush. That's Tim Geithner. Tim Geithner apparently not as crushed back because he would like, of course, to cash in on all the favors he's done for the banks all these years. So he's going to go to take one of their jobs and make millions of dollars. So he says no to the Federal Reserve. So for all the people who thought President Obama had perhaps learned his lesson, and hey, Geithner and Summers were the people who got us into this mess. Geithner was at the New York Fed when he chose not to regulate any of the banks, and that turned into a disaster. No, bad news for you. President Obama has learned none of the lessons. All right, why do we think?
Now, it could be, look, I understand that it seems like, considering that he was considering Geithner and now Summers, that he hasn't learned any lesson, and, you know, this is a reflection of his true economic, ideology, I suppose. It could be that he's just not a very social person, since he only seems to know two people in Washington.
Yeah.
And it's, whatever the job is, oh, I know this guy Tim. I'm sure he would do well there.
No, John, that's a great point. There was actually another article written where somebody said, hey, can you go outside of the same circle you constantly go back to? And then Bernie Sanders came in and he said, how about Joseph Stiglitz? I mean, I'm not asking for much. He's a Nobel laureate. In fact, he won one by himself and one with another group. He's got basically two Nobels under his belt. And he was right about the crash. He was right about all the things. How about Robert Reich, who was a labor secretary under Clinton, who's a brilliant economist, right? And Obama's like, oh, Reich, Stiglitz, that's a good one. And the question that arises is, when are people going to get it through their thick heads that the guy is not remotely progressive?
You know, what I see here is the same thing that we see with the coaching carousel in the NFL, NBA, any of these places. Once you've established yourself as a legitimate player in this small, tight, elite circle, then no matter what you do, no matter how badly you fail, you keep getting rehired. And it's a circle jerk, you know, and it never stops. And that's the problem we have here. And the big disappointment that we've all had is that we thought Obama was the guy who would stop that circle jerk. That he's the guy who's going to see outside of the box and get the right people in the right places to make real change. It's not happening. And it's been, what, 6 years now? It's never going to happen.
Well, if you count his campaign, et cetera, right, for as long as he's been campaigning for president. But Steve, I don't know what led you to believe that. Was it maybe the thousands of placards that said change on there? You know, it turns out, actually, Obama wanted to just jump in and go, come on, guys, help a brother out, right? Yeah. I want to get involved in this circle. This is a great, and what it is, and it's interesting because it combines a lot of the different criticisms. It's the good old boys club, right? Yeah. Both in the NFL, and it certainly was much more so, but still to some degree. Norv Turner apparently will be hired for the rest of eternity, right? No matter how much of a failure he is. And the good old boys club in Washington, and in fact, people are saying, come on, you've got an enormously qualified woman here for the job, and she was right about everything. Why? And Larry Summers, one of the top criticisms they have of him is that he's been horrible to women, like all the women that he's worked with, Christina Romer, Sheila Bair. He has, even though, again, they were all right about the stimulus, about the recession, et cetera, he distanced them from the president. They thought that he was very dismissive towards them. And of course, famously, when he ran Harvard, he said women were not as good at science and engineering. It would be awesome to have a woman replace. But the woman-man thing I don't care that much about. I care more about the same old people, whether they're guys or girls, right, as opposed to bringing in somebody fresh who might actually be right.
I mean, for me, it really goes to the heart of Obama's, whether you want to call it weakness or whether you want to call it his inability to do things that are anti-establishment. Because there are certain things that he must do to get a pat on the back from the establishment, and he's deathly afraid to do something different. Stability to him even if it's a stable and organized destruction of our economy, is better than destabilizing what we have.
Well, that's the central irony of Obama's campaigns and administration, that he ran on change, but the reality is he hates change. He loves stability. He does not want to rock the boat. If there's one thing that you could characterize Obama for, is don't rock the boat.
Well, you know, the thing that Barack Obama ran on, correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember him saying, you can't hire the same guys who drove us into the ditch to drive us out of the ditch.
Yeah, that's exactly what he said.
Didn't he always say that?
Yeah,
and then
that's
here he is.
exactly
He's So Larry Summers was with the repeal of Glass-Steagall. He was for the Commodities and Futures Modernization Act. He's been on the wrong side of every issue. He wanted a smaller stimulus instead of a bigger. So he's been wrong about everything. And yet Barack Obama, who said he doesn't want the guys who drove us in to drive us out, is picking the guy who drove us in. And the thing I love about this is that I can't wait till he has to sit down with Jonathan Karl, because I'll bet he'll really hold his feet to the fire on this.
And that's why he can get away with it.
Yes.
It's like a few Democrats, progressives that say, hey, wait a minute, maybe that's not such a good idea.
Right.
So to that point, finally, there was this theory thrown out there, and David Sirota on our TV show mentioned this. He said maybe they really wanted Janet Yellen, and that she's actually fairly, calling her conservative is not fair, right? But she agrees with generally the same monetary policy that Summers does. And you throw Summers out there as like a boogeyman, like, I can go with Summers, I can go with Dick Cheney, or I can go with Janet Yellen, and people go, Janet Yellen, right? Turns out he was wrong about that. It was a good theory, it was an interesting theory, because when President Obama has done two things since Sirota came up with that. One, he called in House Democrats, and some of the House Democrats said, yeah, Summers seems like a bad guy. Remember the guy who ran us into the ditch? That was Summers, right? And President apparently gave a, quote, full-throated defense of Larry Summers, like, how dare you guys? This is the legendary, beloved Larry Summers. Everybody bow your head, right? And then second of all, he's now sent out all their female surrogates, like Sheryl Sandberg, who's of course a very powerful executive at Facebook, who used to work with Larry Summers in the past, to come out and say, oh, no, Larry Summers? Oh, he's great with women. Oh, he's terrific with women. Larry Summers is a genius. We should definitely go with Larry Summers. So they've sent out a number of those female surrogates to say Larry Summers, and they wouldn't have done that if Obama didn't really want Larry Summers to be the head of the Fed.